The sound of a hand striking flesh echoed through the grand dining room like a gunshot. But it wasn't a face that was slapped. It was the swollen, 9-month pregnant belly of a woman who had done nothing but love a family that despised her. Serafina Moreau stood frozen at the head of a 40-foot mahogany table, surrounded by crystal chandeliers, Michelin-star cuisine, and 12 members of the Volkov family, every single one of them watching in silence. Her hands trembled over her belly. The skin beneath her silk maternity dress stung where the open palm of her mother-in-law, Vladislava Volkov, had just made contact with a child growing inside her. And then Vladislava said the words that would change everything. "This baby," she hissed, adjusting the diamond brooch on her collar as though she had merely brushed away a crumb, "will be my servant." Just like its mother. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. 12 forks were suspended midair. 12 mouths hung open. And Serafina, all 5 feet 4 inches of her, 8 pounds heavier than she had ever been in her life, with swollen ankles and a heart that had been breaking slowly for 9 months, looked to her husband. Konstantin Volkov sat at the opposite end of the table. His jaw was tight, his eyes were cold, and he did absolutely nothing. He didn't stand up, he didn't defend her, he didn't even put down his wine glass. Instead he looked at Serafina with the same expression he had been giving her for months, a mixture of boredom and contempt, and said, "My mother is right. You should be grateful you're even sitting at this table." Seraphine's vision blurred. Not from tears, although those were coming, but from something deeper, something primal. 9 months of silence, 9 months of swallowed words, 9 months of believing that if she was just patient enough, kind enough, obedient enough, things would change. And in that single slap, she understood the truth. They would never change. But what nobody at that table knew, not Vladislava and her pearls, not Konstantin with his wine, not a single member of the Volkov dynasty, was that in exactly 4 minutes, an ambulance would arrive at the front gates of the Volkov estate, and it would not be coming for Serafina. Now, to understand how we arrived at this moment, at this woman standing alone in a room full of wealth and cruelty, we need to go back to the beginning, back to the day Serafina Moreau met Konstantin Volkov, and made the only mistake she would ever regret. She loved him. But before we get to that, love, you need to understand the woman Serafina was before Konstantin Volkov ever learned her name. Because that woman, the one who existed before the diamond rings and the silk dresses and the gilded cage, she's the key to everything that comes after. Serafina grew up in a small coastal town called Beaumont, the kind of place where everyone knew your name and your grandmother's maiden name and what you ate for breakfast on a Tuesday. Her father, Raphael Moreau, was a quiet, brilliant man. He ran a modest construction consulting firm out of a weathered office near the harbor. People in town thought of him as a good man who lived simply. He drove a 15-year-old truck. He wore the same work boots until the soles fell off. And every Sunday, he took Serafina to the cliffs overlooking the ocean and told her stories about the buildings he'd helped design across 3 continents. What nobody in Beaumont knew, and what Raphael had deliberately kept hidden, was the true scale of his work. Behind the Modus office and the old truck, Raphael Moreau held patents on seismic reinforcement technology used in skyscrapers across the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and Eastern Europe. His consulting firm wasn't small at all. It was a web of holding companies, licensing agreements, and intellectual property worth, conservatively, $400 million. But Raphael never told Serafina he wanted her to earn her own way, to build her own identity without the shadow of wealth. So he lived simply, loved her fiercely, and when a rare cancer took him, when Serafina was 22, he left behind a will that would sit unopened in the vault of a law firm called Blackwell and Associates for years to come. Because Serafina, in her grief, wasn't thinking about wills or money. She was thinking about architecture. She had inherited her father's love for buildings, for the way steel and glass could tell a story. She graduated top of her class from the National Institute of Design, won a fellowship to study in Milan, and by 25 she was one of the most promising young architects in the country. She was, by every measure, a woman who had built herself from nothing. Or at least, that's what she believed. What she didn't know was that her father had built something too. Something enormous, something hidden, something that would one day save her life. But we'll get to that. That's when she met Konstantin. It was at a charity gala in the capital. Serafina was there because her firm had donated a design for a children's hospital. Konstantin was there because the Volkov family owned half the city's real estate, and galas were where they displayed their power, the way museums display priceless art. He was tall, dark hair swept back, a jawline that could have been carved from the same marble his family imported from Tuscany, and he walked through the crowd the way a shark moves through water, with effortless, quiet authority. When he entered a room, conversations paused. Women turned. Men straightened. He had that gravitational pull that certain people possess, the kind that makes you lean in even when every instinct tells you to step back. He noticed Serafina standing alone by a window, studying the building's structural framework instead of the party. He later told her that's what caught his eye, that she was the only woman in the room looking up at the ceiling instead of at him. Their courtship was a whirlwind. Constantine was charming in the way that only very dangerous men can be. He sent flowers that arrived by the roomful. He flew her to private islands for weekend brunches. He made her feel like the center of the universe. And Serafina, who had spent her life surrounded by blueprints and concrete, who had never experienced that kind of overwhelming attention, fell completely happy. Best friend Margot Dupont saw through it immediately. Something about him doesn't sit right, Margot said over coffee one morning, stirring her espresso with a skeptical frown. Margot was a forensic accountant with a mind like a scalpel. She could read balance sheets the way poets read verse, and she could read people even better. He's too polished, Ciaro. Men like that, they're not charming because they love you. They're charming because they want something. But Serafina was in love. And love, when it's new and intoxicating, is deaf to warning. They married 6 months. Later, Margot was the maid of honor. She smiled through the ceremony, but Serafina saw the worry in her eyes, the way she watched Constantine, the way a detective watches a suspect through one-way glass. The ceremony was held at the Volkov estate, a property so vast it had its own zip code, 800 guests, a dress that cost more than Seraphine's apartment, and a mother-in-law, Vladislava, who watched the entire ceremony from the front row without smiling once. That should have been the first sign. But Serafina, standing in, her wedding gown with wildflowers in her hair and hope in her chest, told herself that Vladislava was simply a protective mother. That once she saw how much Serafina loved her son, the ice would thaw. That kindness would be met with kindness. She was wrong. Vladislava Volkov was not simply a mother. She was an institution, a force of nature wrapped in Chanel and razor wire. She had built the Volkov real estate empire alongside her late husband, and when he died, she didn't mourn. She consolidated. She was the kind of woman who viewed her son not as a child but as an asset, and any woman who married him was not a daughter-in-law but a liability. She had buried 2 husbands, outlived countless business rivals, and accumulated power the way some people accumulate regret, relentlessly and without ever looking back. From the very first day of the marriage, Vladislava made her position clear. "Will not redecorate," she told Serafina on their first morning in the estate. "You will not rearrange the kitchen. You will not choose the menus. You will not invite friends without my approval. This is my house. You are a guest." Serafina looked to Constantine, expecting him to intervene. He was reading the financial section of the newspaper. "Just do what she says," he muttered without looking up. It's easier that way. It would become the anthem of Seraphine's marriage. Everything was easier when she surrendered, easier when she didn't argue, easier when she folded herself smaller and smaller until she fit into the tiny space the Volkov family had designated for her. Easier was not a word, it was a cage. And so began the slow, methodical dismantling of Serafina Moreau. Week by week, piece by piece, her identity was stripped away. First, Vladislava insisted she leave her architecture firm. "A Volkov wife does not work," she declared. At dinner one evening, and Constantine nodded as though this were the most natural thing in the world, Serafina protested. She had projects. She had clients. She had a career she had built with her own 2 hands. "You have a husband," Vladislava said coldly, "and that should be enough." Serafina gave up her firm. She told herself it was temporary. That once she proved herself, once she earned Vladislava's respect, she could go back to her work. She told herself a lot of things in those early months. Most of them were lies she needed to survive. She still remembers the day she cleaned out her office. Her partner, a brilliant woman named Juliet, had cried. Their team of 12 had stood in the hallway, silent, as Serafina boxed up her drafting tools, her model kits, her collection of architectural photographs from around the world. She left behind a half-finished design for a library. It was going to be her masterpiece, a building shaped like an open book, with walls of glass that let the light pour in like words on a page. She never finished it. Then came the isolation. Vladislava didn't like Margot. She called her that nosy accountant and told Serafina that her friend was a bad influence. Gradually, phone calls were discouraged. Visits were cancelled. Seraphine's contact with the outside world shrank until it was barely a whisper. And Constantine, he was busy. Always busy. Meetings, trips, conferences, all the apparatus of a man running $1 billion empire, or at least appearing to. Because what Serafina didn't know yet was that the Volkov Empire was not as solid as its marble facades suggested. Beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Massive debts, failed developments, a portfolio leveraged to the breaking point, but those were secrets kept in boardrooms and bank vaults. Far from the eyes of the pregnant wife sleeping alone in a mansion she wasn't allowed to call home. There were days when the loneliness was so heavy it felt like a physical weight on her chest. Days when she wandered the vast, empty corridors of the estate. Past rooms she wasn't allowed to rearrange, past art she hadn't chosen, past windows that looked out on gardens she wasn't permitted to redesign. She felt like a ghost haunting someone else's house, a beautiful, expansive, perfectly maintained house that was slowly suffocating her. And then came the pregnancy. Serafina discovered she was expecting 6 months into the marriage. She found out alone, in the bathroom of the East Wing, staring at 2 pink lines on a test while the house echoed with emptiness. She was terrified and elated in equal measure. When she told Constantine, his reaction was not what she expected. He didn't embrace her. He didn't cry. He looked at her for a long moment, then picked up his phone and called his mother. "She's pregnant," he said flatly, as though reporting a quarterly earnings update. Serafina could hear Vladislava's voice through the phone, sharp and commanding. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Instructions, directives, orders. Constantine hung up and looked at Serafina. "My mother will handle the pregnancy arrangements," he said. "She has opinions about the nursery, the doctor, the diet. Just go along with it." And Serafina, still clutching the positive test, felt the first crack in her heart widen into a fissure. The months that followed were the loneliest of her life. Vladislava took over every aspect of the pregnancy with military precision. She chose the obstetrician, a severe woman named Dr. Hargrove, who reported every detail back to the matriarch. She dictated Seraphine's meals, her exercise schedule, even her sleeping hours. And she made it abundantly clear that the child growing inside Seraphine's body was not Seraphine's child at all. "This is a Volkov baby," Vladislava said one afternoon, placing a proprietary hand on Seraphine's growing belly without asking permission. "The Volkov name, the Volkov blood, the Volkov future. You are merely the vessel." Serafina wanted to scream. She wanted to grab that bony hand and fling it away. But she was 7 months pregnant, alone, without her career, without her friends, without her father, and married to a man who treated her like furniture. So she said nothing. She swallowed the words the way she swallowed everything else. But inside, something was changing. Something was hardening. The soft clay of Seraphine's spirit was being fired in the kiln of suffering, and what was emerging was something stronger than anyone in the Volkov household could have imagined. It was around her 7th month that Serafina discovered the affair. She wasn't snooping. She was looking for her prenatal vitamins, which she thought Constantine might have moved to his study. She opened the top drawer of his desk and found a phone. Not his regular phone. A second one, sleek, black, without a case, tucked beneath a stack of contracts. The screen lit up as she touched it. No passcode. Constantine had never imagined she'd find it. The messages were from someone named Natasha Serova. There were hundreds of them, intimate, graphic, tender in ways that Constantine had never been with Serafina. Photos that made her stomach lurch, and a thread of conversation that revealed the affair had been going on since before the wedding. Before the wedding, Serafina sat on the cold hardwood floor of the study, 8 months pregnant, and read every single message. She didn't cry. She was past crying. She read with the clinical precision of a woman who was already planning her next move, even if she didn't know it yet. One message in particular burned into her memory. It was from Constantine to Natasha, dated 3 weeks after the wedding. "Don't worry, she's nothing. My mother chose her because she's easy to control. Once she gives me an heir, we'll be together, I promise. She's nothing. My mother chose her. Easy to control. Once she gives me an heir." Each phrase was a nail in the coffin of a marriage Serafina had poured her entire being into. Each word was a confession that everything, the courtship, the flowers, the private islands, the proposal under the stars, had been a performance, A transaction. A deal struck between a mother and her puppet son, with Serafina cast as the expendable prop. Serafina put the phone back exactly where she found it. She closed the drawer. She walked to the bathroom, washed her face, and looked at herself in the mirror. The woman staring back was not the same woman who had walked into this house a year ago. That woman had been hopeful, trusting, full of light, with the quiet fury of someone who has been pushed to the edge and has decided, in the silence of their own mind, that they will not fall. She did not confront Constantine, not yet. She understood, with a clarity that surprised even herself, that confrontation without power is just noise. She needed leverage. She needed a plan. She needed Margot. The call was made in secret, from a payphone in the town to miles from the estate, during one of the rare afternoon walks she was permitted to take. "Margot," she whispered, her voice cracking for the first time in months. "I need your help." There was no hesitation, no questions about why Serafina had been silent for months. Margot Dupin simply said, "Tell me everything." And Serafina did. Every indignity, every cruelty, every message on that hidden phone. And when she was done, Margot was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. "I'm going to destroy them," Margot said, calmly, and there was something in her voice, a cold, controlled fury, that made Serafina believe every syllable. This was not the voice of a friend offering comfort. This was the voice of a forensic accountant who had found fraud, and who intended to follow every thread until the entire tapestry unraveled. "But first," Margot continued, "we need to talk about your father's will." Serafina blinked. "What about my father's will?" Margot said slowly. "Did Raphael ever tell you about the Moreau Trust?" "No." "What trust?" There was a pause on the line. Serafina could hear Margot choosing her words, the way a surgeon chooses an instrument. Honey, Margot's voice was gentle now. "The way you speak to someone who is about to have their entire world rearranged. Your father was worth $430 million, and every cent of it is sitting in a trust with your name on it, managed by a firm called Blackwell and Associates. I found out 6 months ago when I was auditing a construction licensing deal and your father's name came up on a patent. I've been trying to reach you ever since." The payphone booth seemed to shrink around Serafina. The ocean wind whipped her hair across her face. $430 million. Her father, the man with the old truck and the worn boots. The man who told her stories about buildings on the cliffs. "That's not possible," she whispered. Her legs felt weak. She leaned against the glass of the phone booth and placed her free hand on her belly, as though the baby could anchor her too. A reality that was rapidly shifting beneath her feet. "It's not only possible," Margot said. "It's documented. And Sierra, there's something else. One of the patents your father held. The seismic reinforcement technology. It's currently licensed to the Volkov Construction Group. They've been using it for their entire Eastern European portfolio. They owe the Moreau Trust $62 million in unpaid licensing fees. Your husband's company owes you money they don't even know they owe." Serafina leaned against the glass of the phone. Booth end closed her eyes. The baby kicked hard, as though punctuating the revelation. "What do I do?" she asked. "For now," Margot said, "you do nothing. You go back to that house. You smile. You eat their food. You let that witch touch your belly and say whatever she wants. And you wait. Because what's coming for them, Sierra, they won't see it until it's already over." Serafina walked back to the estate that afternoon with a straight spine and a secret burning in her chest like a coal. The days that followed were excruciating. Knowing what she knew about the affair, about the money, about everything, and having to sit across from Vladislava at breakfast and nod politely while the woman dictated what brand of diapers were acceptable for her grandchild, having to lie next to Constantine at night, listening to his breathing, knowing that the same mouth that said nothing in her defense whispered love to another woman on a secret phone. But Serafina endured. She smiled at breakfast. She nodded at Vladislava's instructions. She ate the food she was given and wore the clothes she was told to wear and attended the appointments that were scheduled without her input. She was perfect, obedient, invisible, and behind that mask of compliance. Her mind was working like the precision gears of a Swiss watch, turning, calculating, preparing, because Serafina understood something that the Volkovs, for all their wealth and cunning, had never grasped. The most dangerous person in any room is not the one who's shouting. It's the one who's silent, the one who's listening, the one who's waiting. Margot worked in the shadows. She contacted Theron Blackwell, the attorney managing the Moreau Trust, and confirmed every detail. The trust was irrevocable. fully funded, and named Serafina as the sole beneficiary. It contained the patents, the licensing agreements, a portfolio of commercial real estate across 4 countries, and a controlling interest in a company called Moreau Infrastructure Global, which, as it turned out, held the construction permits for 3 of the Volkov Group's most critical active developments. In other words, without Serafin's inherited company, the Volkovs couldn't finish building their most important projects. They literally could not pour concrete without her permission. Theron leaned back in his chair and let that revelation breathe. The cafe around them hummed with the ordinary sounds of ordinary lives: espresso machines, quiet conversations, the clink of ceramic, while between them on the table lay the documents that would dismantle one of the most powerful families in the country. Go also pulled the Volkov Group's financial records through public filings and industry contacts. What she found was staggering. The empire was hemorrhaging money. Vladislava had been funding their lifestyle through a chain of high-interest loans secured against properties that were already mortgaged. Constantine, for all his suits and swagger, was essentially managing a house of cards. One strong wind, one mispayment, one licensing dispute, and the whole thing would collapse. They're broke, Saramago told her during another secret phone call. Not broke like normal people broke. Broke like they owe 300 million to a consortium of banks who are very, very tired of waiting. Serafina listened. She absorbed, and she waited. The dinner happened on a Thursday evening in October, when the trees on the estate were burning with autumn color and the air had that crisp, promising bite that comes before everything changes. Vladislava had organized a family gathering, ostensibly to celebrate the imminent arrival of the baby, but really to perform the ritual she loved most: displaying her power. The table was set for 14, Vladislava at the head, Constantine at the opposite end. Between them, an assortment of Volkov cousins, uncles, and associates, all of whom orbited the matriarch like planets around a cold, distant star. Serafina was seated at the middle of the table, which was not an accident. Vladislava wanted her visible, displayed, a trophy of obedience. The evening began with the usual rituals. Vladislava held court. She discussed the family's legacy as though it were a kingdom rather than a portfolio of leveraged properties. She praised Constantine, who nodded with the practiced humility of a man who believed his own myth. And she ignored Serafina entirely, which was, by now, the default setting. The trouble started during the second course. Serafina reached for the salt, a small gesture, mundane, but Vladislava's eyes, which missed nothing, latched onto it like a hawk spotting movement in a field. Did I say you could season the food? Vladislava said, her voice slicing through the table's polite murmur. 14 heads turned. Serafina paused, her hand suspended over the salt shaker. I was just the chef prepared this meal according to my specifications, Vladislava continued, her voice rising. Every ingredient was chosen for the health of my grandchild. And do you think you know better? You think your peasant palate understands nutrition? The table was silent. Forks were lowered. Eyes darted between the 2 women. Serafina put down the salt shaker. I'm sorry, she said quietly, even though she was not sorry at all, even though the word tasted like poison on her tongue. But Vladislava was not finished. She had an audience. And Vladislava Volkov with an audience was like a fire, with fresh oxygen, the matriarch said, standing from her chair and smoothing her jacket with deliberate, theatrical slowness. I've been very patient with you, Serafina, very generous. I took you into this family when you had nothing. No name, no fortune, no breeding, just a dead father and a worthless degree. The words landed like physical blows. Serafina felt each one in her chest. A dead father, worthless degree. She gripped the edge of the table and breathed. And what have you given in return? Vladislava walked slowly down the length of the table, toward Serafina, her heels clicking on the marble floor like a metronome counting down to detonation. You've given us a swollen belly and a mouth that eats too much. That's all you are. A vessel. A container for Volkov blood. Serafina stood. It took effort. At 9 months, everything took effort. But she stood because she would not receive. This sitting down, Vladislava, she said, and her voice was steady, which surprised everyone, including herself. I have given this family nothing but respect and patience. The slap came without warning. Not to her face. To her belly. Vladislava Volkov raised her hand and struck the swollen curve of Serafin's pregnant stomach with an open palm, hard enough to produce a sound that made every person at the table flinch. This baby, Vladislava said, her eyes burning, with something between contempt and possessiveness, will be my servant, just like its mother. The room imploded in silence. It was the kind of silence that has weight, that presses against your eardrums and fills your lungs like water. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke, and Serafina, for one terrible, crystalline moment, felt the world narrow to a single point of pain and fury and absolute, irrevocable clarity. She looked at Constantine, her husband, the father of her child, the man who had promised to love, honor, and protect her. He took a sip of wine. "My mother is right," he said. "You should be grateful you're even sitting at this table." Serafina felt something inside her. Snap, not break, snap, like a cable under too much tension that suddenly lets go and whips through the air with lethal force. She didn't cry, she didn't scream. She simply looked at Vladislava with an expression that made the older woman, for the first time in years, take an involuntary step back. "You touched my child," Serafina said quietly. "Remember this moment. Because one day very soon, you will wish you hadn't." Vladislava laughed. It was a harsh, dismissive sound, the kind of laugh designed to reduce another person to nothing. "What will you do? Leave go where you have nothing. You are nothing." And then everything changed. Serafina opened her mouth to respond, but she never got the chance, because at that exact moment, there was a sound from the other end of the table, a gasp, then a crash, then chaos. Konstantin Volkov had collapsed, his wineglass shattered on the marble floor. His body slumped sideways, then slid from the chair, like a puppet whose strings had been cut. His face was gray, his hands were clutching his chest. His eyes were wide with a terror that no amount of money or power could mask. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. Then everyone moved at once. Konstantin. Vladislava screamed, her cruelty evaporating instantly, replaced by raw, animal panic. She shoved past chairs and relatives, her heels skidding on the polished floor. "Call an ambulance. Call an ambulance. Now?" The room erupted. Cousins shouted. Uncles fumbled for phones. A chair was overturned. Wine pooled on the floor like a dark omen, and Serafina stood exactly where she was, her hand resting gently on her belly where Vladislava had struck her, watching the chaos with an expression that was not satisfaction, not revenge, not cruelty. It was simply recognition, a recognition that the universe, in its own time and its own way, was beginning to balance the scales. The ambulance arrived in 11 minutes. Paramedics rushed through the grand foyer, their boots squeaking on the marble that Vladislava kept polished to a military shine. They loaded Konstantin onto a stretcher while he gasped for air, his face now the color of old paper. Vladislava followed them out, clutching her son's hand, screaming instructions at the paramedics as though she could command his heart to keep beating the way she commanded everything else. Nobody asked if Serafina was okay. Nobody checked on the baby. Nobody even looked at her. She stood alone in the dining room, surrounded by overturned chairs and half-eaten food and the ghost of the most terrible evening of her life. And she placed both hands on her belly and whispered, "We're going to be okay, little one. I promise." She picked up her phone and texted Margot 3 words, "It's happening tonight." Then she called a car, because of course nobody offered her a ride, and made her way to the hospital alone, 9 months pregnant, driving through streets, blurred by the tears she finally allowed herself to shed. The hospital was St. Alban's, the private medical center, where the Volkov family had a wing named after them. Serafina arrived 30 minutes after the ambulance, having driven herself because no one had offered to take her. She found the intensive care unit on the 4th floor and was met by a doctor named Dr. Alessio Ferranti, a cardiologist with kind eyes and an honest face. "Mrs. Volkov," he said, gently guiding her to a private consultation room while Vladislava held vigil outside the ICU like a gargoyle guarding a cathedral. "Your husband has suffered a significant cardiac event. The preliminary assessment suggests cardiomyopathy, likely stress-induced, possibly exacerbated by other factors we're still investigating." "Will he survive?" Serafina asked. And she realized, with a complex mixture of feelings she couldn't fully name, that she genuinely wanted to know. Despite everything, despite the betrayal and the cruelty and the hidden phone and the slap, she didn't want him to die. She wanted him to live. She wanted him to live long enough to see what was coming. "We're optimistic," Dr. Ferrante said, "but he'll need surgery, a procedure to repair the valve. It's serious, but survivable. However, I should tell you, Mrs. Volkov, that when we ran his blood work, we found something unusual." Serafina felt the hair on her arms stand up. "What kind of unusual?" Dr. Ferrante hesitated. It was a doctor's hesitation, the kind that comes before information that will change the shape of someone's life. Your husband has been taking a medication that was not prescribed by any doctor in our network. It's a stimulant, commonly used, to mask fatigue and enhance cognitive function. In high doses, and your husband has been taking very high doses, it causes exactly the kind of cardiac damage we're seeing. Someone has been giving your husband unprescribed medication, or he's been obtaining it on his own. Either way, it's been destroying his heart for months. The room felt like it was tilting. Serafina gripped the armrest of her chair and forced herself to breathe. Poisoning. The word didn't belong in hospitals and consultations. It belonged in crime novels and courtroom dramas. But here it was, sitting between her and this kindly doctor like a grenade with the pin pulled. Serafina stared at the doctor. Her mind raced through possibilities, through memories, through the thousand small details she had noticed and dismissed over the past year. Constantine's irritability, his mood swings, his increasingly erratic behavior, the way he sometimes seemed wired, electric, vibrating with an energy that wasn't natural. It would give him something like that, she whispered. Dr. Ferrante shook his head. That's not for me to determine. But someone close to your husband has been, whether intentionally or not, poisoning him. The word hung in the air like smoke. Poisoning. Serafina left the consultation room and walked slowly down the corridor toward the ICU. Vladislava was there, sitting ramrod straight in a plastic chair that was clearly beneath her dignity, barking orders at nurses who were too professional to tell her to stop for a moment. Serafina watched her. She watched the way Vladislava's hands trembled when she thought no one was looking. She watched the way the woman's eyes darted to the ICU door every few seconds with a desperation that was almost human, and then a thought occurred too. Serafina, a terrible thought. The kind of thought that lodges in your brain like a splinter and refuses to come out. The stimulants. The unprescribed medication. Vladislava controlled everything in the Volkov household. Every meal. Every supplement. Every vitamin. She had even controlled Seraphine's prenatal care. If anyone had access to Constantine's daily regimen, it was Vladislava. Or why would a mother poison her own son? Unless she wasn't trying to poison him. Unless she was trying to control him. To keep him sharp, focused, obedient. To keep her puppet dancing on its strings. Serafina filed the thought away. She placed it carefully alongside the photographs of the secret phone messages. Alongside the memory of the slap. Alongside every whispered cruelty and silent betrayal. She was building a case the way her father had built buildings, one piece at a time, one load-bearing wall after another, until the structure was strong enough to stand on its own. The days following Constantine's collapse was strange and surreal. The estate, usually so rigidly controlled, fell into disarray. Vladislava spent most of her time at the hospital, which meant that, for the first time in her marriage, Serafina was alone in the house. Truly alone. Without surveillance. Without schedules, without the constant, suffocating presence of a woman who had made her life a waking nightmare. She used the time wisely. The first call was to It's time, Serafina said. The second call was to Theron Blackwell. Theron Blackwell was a tall, silver-haired attorney with a voice like aged whiskey and a reputation for winning cases that other lawyers considered unwinnable. He had managed the Morrow Trust for 8 years. Patiently waiting for the day Serafina would come to claim her inheritance. Miss Moreau, he said when she called, and she noticed he used her maiden name. I've been expecting your call for a very long time. They met at a cafe in the city, away from the estate, away from the Volkov name and its long shadow. Theron laid out the full scope of the Moreau Trust with the precision of a surgeon opening a patient. Your father, he said, spreading documents. Across the table was one of the most brilliant structural engineers of his generation. His patents alone generate $12 million a year in licensing revenue. The trust holds controlling interests in Moreau Infrastructure Global, which manages construction permits, geological surveys, and seismic assessments for major developments across 4 continents. He paused to let that settle, and he continued. Volkov Construction Group is, as we speak, dependent on 3 active permits held by Moreau Infrastructure Global. Without those permits, their developments in Bucharest, Prague, and Istanbul cannot proceed. They are also $62 million behind on licensing payments for the seismic technology they've been using without renegotiating the contract. In essence, Mrs. Volkov, the family that treats you like a servant cannot finish building their empire without your company's permission. Serafina stared at the documents. Her father's signature was on one of them. His handwriting, the same handwriting that had labeled her school lunch bags and signed her birthday cards, was there on a contract worth tens of millions. I want to activate the trust, she said. Theron smiled. It was a careful, professional smile, but beneath it was the unmistakable warmth of a man who had been rooting for her since the day he read Raphael's will. I was hoping you'd say that. While Serafina was assembling her legal arsenal, the situation at the hospital took another unexpected turn. Constantine was recovering. The surgery had been successful, and he was awake, lucid, and, for the first time in months, the stimulants were out of his system. The fog that had clouded his mind for so long was lifting, and with it came memories and realizations that hit him like cold water. It was during one of these lucid moments, on a Tuesday afternoon, with autumn rain streaking the hospital windows, that Constantine overheard a conversation he was not meant to hear. Vladislava was on the phone in the hallway outside his room. The door was slightly ajar. She didn't know he was awake. No, she was saying, her voice tight with irritation. He'll recover. The doctors are confident. But we need to move quickly on the Natasha situation. She's becoming impatient. I promised her that once the baby was born and Serafina was out of the picture, she would take her place. If we don't follow through, she'll go public, and that will ruin everything. Constantine felt the room tilt. He pressed the button to raise the head of his bed, slowly, silently, and listened. I've already spoken to the lawyer about the divorce terms, Vladislava continued. Serafina gets nothing. We invoke the prenuptial agreement, cite irreconcilable differences, and she leaves with whatever she came with, which is nothing. The baby stays with us. Natasha moves in within 3 months. It's all arranged. A pause. Then Vladislava's voice dropped to a register that Constantine had never heard before. Cold, calculated, devoid of any maternal pretense. The child is the only thing that matters. Serafina is disposable. She always was. Constantine lay in his hospital bed and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Shame. Deep, acid, corrosive shame. Because he realized, in that sterile white room, with the beeping machines and the rain on the glass, that his mother hadn't orchestrated a marriage. She had orchestrated a breeding program. Serafina was never meant to be a wife. She was meant to be an incubator. And he, Constantine, had been too drugged, too controlled, too willfully blind to see it. And Natasha, his affair, his escape, his rebellion against his mother's control, even that had been arranged. Even his betrayal had been choreographed by Vladislava. She had introduced them, she had encouraged it. She had used Natasha as both carrot and stick, a reward for compliance and a weapon against Serafina. Everything had been his mother's design. Constantine stared at the ceiling and felt the foundations of his entire life crack. But understanding and action are very different things. And Constantine, for all his new clarity, was still a man who had been controlled his entire life. Old habits are chains, and chains don't break just because you see them. Meanwhile, Seraphine's plan was accelerating. Margot had assembled a team, a forensic accountant, a corporate litigation attorney, and a private investigator named Dorian Voss. A former intelligence officer with a talent for finding things people worked very hard to hide. Within days, Dorian had uncovered the full scope of Vladislava's machinations, the stimulants being fed to Constantine. Vladislava had been ordering them through a shell company, having them disguised as dietary supplements and mixed into his morning protein shake. She had been microdosing her own son with cognitive enhancers for years, keeping him alert enough to work but dependent enough to obey. The affair with Natasha. Vladislava had introduced him at a private event 2 years before Serafina entered. The picture, Natasha Serova, was not a random woman. She was the daughter of a business associate Vladislava wanted to merge with. The affair was a contract, a transaction, and Natasha knew it. The prenuptial agreement, it was airtight on the surface, designed to leave Serafina with nothing. But Theron Blackwell found a clause, buried in the fine print, that lawyers had missed. In the event of proven infidelity by either spouse, the agreement was void. And thanks to the messages on Constantine's secret phone, which Serafina had photographed during that night in the study, they had proof of infidelity that would blow the prenup apart. The pieces were falling into place, but the final act needed a stage. Vladislava, oblivious to the storm gathering around her, organized another event. This time, it was a press conference at the Volkov Group's headquarters, intended to announce a major new development project and reassure investors that the company was strong despite Konstantine's hospitalization. She planned to present herself as the matriarch holding the empire together. She invited journalists, investors, board members, and business partners. She also invited Serafina because she wanted the pregnant wife visible, her family united, a show of strength. What she did not know was that Serafina had invited some guests of her own. The morning of the press conference, Serafina sat at the kitchen table of the small apartment Margot had helped her rent in secret, a modest two-bedroom flat, far from the marble and crystal of the Volkov estate. She drank herbal tea because the baby didn't like coffee. She reviewed the documents Theron had prepared, and she looked at a photograph of her father that she kept in her wallet, creased and faded from years of handling. "I could use one of your cliffside pep talks right about now, Papa," she whispered. The photograph didn't answer, but Serafina felt something, a warmth in her chest, a steadiness in her hands. That felt very much like her father's quiet, unshakable presence. She stood up. She put on the white dress. She drove to the city. The press conference was held in the atrium of the Volkov Group's glass tower in the financial district. 200 people, cameras, microphones, a podium with the Volkov crest. Vladislava, the center, dressed in a black suit that looked like armor, her silver hair swept back, her eyes like polished steel. Serafina arrived late. This was intentional. She wanted all eyes to turn, and they did. She walked through the glass doors of the atrium, wearing a simple white dress that accentuated her 9-month belly. No jewelry, no heels, no pretense. She looked, in that moment, like everything Vladislava was not: genuine, vulnerable, and absolutely unafraid. Vladislava saw her and frowned. The plan was for Serafina to sit quietly in the front row and look supportive, not to walk in like she owned the room. But Serafina did not sit down. She walked straight to the podium. Vladislava's smile hardened. "Serafina dear, your seat." "As I think I'll stand," Serafina said, and her voice carried across the atrium with a clarity that silenced the room. Vladislava leaned toward her and whispered, "Sit down now. Don't make a scene." Serafina looked at her mother-in-law with those hollow eyes that had been filling. Slowly, steadily, with something much more powerful than pain. She looked at her with power. "I'm not making a scene," Serafina said into the microphone, and the words reverberated off the glass walls. "I'm making an announcement." The room held its breath. "My name is Serafina Moreau. Some of you know me as Serafina Volkov. But today, I am speaking as the sole beneficiary and acting chair of the Moreau Trust, the controlling entity behind Moreau Infrastructure Global." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The name Moreau was not unknown in construction circles. Journalists exchanged glances. Investors leaned forward. Board members looked confused. Vladislava's face went white. Not pale, white. The color of bone. "Moreau Infrastructure Global," Serafina continued, "holds the construction permits for 3 of the Volkov Group's most critical, active developments. It also holds the licensing rights to the seismic reinforcement technology that the Volkov Group has been using, without proper payment, for the past 8 years. The total outstanding debt owed by the Volkov Group to the Moreau Trust is $6 million. She'll let that number land." She watched it hit the audience like a physical force. Investors' faces shifted from curiosity to alarm. Board members reached for their phones. Journalists scribbled furiously. "Effective immediately," Serafina said. "I am suspending all permits and licensing agreements with the Volkov Construction Group until the outstanding debts are paid in full and a comprehensive audit of the company's financial practices is completed." The room erupted, cameras flashed, voices overlapped. Someone shouted a question, but Serafina wasn't finished. "I also want to address a personal matter," she said, and her voice dropped to a register that was soft, but carried the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights. "For the past year, I have been subjected to systematic emotional abuse, financial control, and deliberate isolation by members of the Volkov family. I was forced to abandon my career. I was cut off from my friends and family. I was treated, in the words of my mother-in-law, as a vessel and a servant." She looked directly at Vladislava. The matriarch was gripping the edge of the podium, so hard her knuckles had gone white, her jaw was locked, her eyes were burning. "3 days ago," Serafina said, at her family dinner attended by 14 members of the Volkov family, My mother-in-law struck my 9-month pregnant belly and declared that my unborn child would be her servant. A gasp swept through the audience. A journalist in the front row put her hand over her mouth. Nobody in that room stopped her, including my husband. The silence that followed was total, absolute, the kind of silence that falls after an explosion, when the debris is still settling and the world hasn't quite figured out what just happened. Vladislava broke it. She stepped forward, her composure fracturing like ice on a warm day, and hissed, "You ungrateful little nobody. You think you can stand here and I'm not finished," Serafina said. And something in her tone, something ancient and immovable, stopped Vladislava mid. During my husband's hospitalization, Serafina continued, medical professionals discovered that he had been ingesting unprescribed stimulant medication for an extended period. This medication, which was causing his cardiac failure, was being administered without his knowledge. She paused. The room was electric. Every camera was pointed at Vladislava. An investigation conducted by a licensed private investigator has traced the procurement of this medication to a shell company controlled by Vladislava Volkov. My mother-in-law has been drugging her own son. If the previous revelation was a bomb, this one was a nuclear weapon. Vladislava's face contorted. Her mask, the one she had worn for decades, the one made of power and control and absolute certainty, crumbled. She looked around the room wildly, searching for an ally, a lifeline, a way out. She found none. "That's a lie," she screamed. "That's a lie, and I will destroy you for," but her words were drowned out by the doors of the atrium opening. 2 uniformed officers walked in, accompanied by Dorian Voss, who had the calm, unhurried demeanor of a man who had seen far worse. Behind them was Theron Blackwell, carrying a leather briefcase with the quiet authority of a man holding all the winning cards. "Vladislava Volkov," one of the officers said, "we have a warrant for your arrest on charges of administering a noxious substance, financial fraud, and conspiracy to commit coercive control." For the first time in her life, Vladislava Volkov had nothing to say. The officers approached. Vladislava looked at them, then at Serafina, then at the cameras capturing every second. She searched for her armor, her words, her power, but they were gone, stripped away in the space of 5 minutes by the quiet, pregnant woman she had dismissed as nothing. As they led Vladislava toward the doors, the matriarch turned one last time. Her eyes found sick fins, and in them was something Serafina had never seen before. Not anger, not contempt, fear. "You were a vessel," Vladislava whispered. "That's all you were ever supposed to be." The words hung in the air for a moment. The cameras captured them, the microphones recorded them, and Serafina, standing at the podium with her unborn child safe inside her, looked at this woman who had tried to reduce her to nothing and felt not rage, not vindication, but something quieter. Something that felt almost like pity. Serafina placed a hand on her belly and said, calmly, clearly, so that every microphone in the room could hear, "I was never a vessel. I was the foundation you were too blind to see." Vladislava was led away. The cameras followed her. The story was already breaking on every news channel, every social media feed, every financial wire service. The Volkov dynasty, built on marble and manipulation, was crumbling in real time. But the story wasn't over. Not yet. 3 days after the press conference, Serafina went into labor, not at the Volkov estate, which she had left immediately after the event, but at a private birthing center recommended by Dr. Ferrante, surrounded by Margot Theron, and a team of medical professionals who treated her with the kindness and respect she had been denied for a year. The labor was long. 14 hours, the hardest 14 hours of Seraphine's life, and she had lived through some hard hours. Margot held her hand and told her terrible jokes that somehow made her laugh between contractions. The medical team was gentle, encouraging, present in a way that no one in the Volkov household had ever been. And, through the pain, through the waves that crashed over her body like the ocean against the cliffs of Beaumont, Serafina held on to one thought: "I am bringing someone into the world who will never, ever be called a servant." And at 4:17 in the morning, with autumn rain drumming on the windows of the birthing suite, Serafina Moreau gave birth to a girl. 7 pounds, 4 ounces, a full head of dark hair, lungs that announced her arrival with a cry so powerful it made the attending nurse laugh. Serafina held her daughter for the first time and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, whole. She named her Evangeline, after her mother, who had passed when Serafina was a child, a name that means bearer of good news. and good news was exactly what Evangeline brought. Because as Serafina lay in the recovery room, cradling her newborn, the door opened, and Konstantin Volkov walked in. He looked different, thinner, paler. The sharp edges of his arrogance had been sanded down by a hospital bed and the demolition of everything he thought he knew. He was wearing a simple sweater, no suit, no watch, no armor, and his eyes, which had been so cold for so long, were red. He had been crying. "Serafina," he said from the doorway, and his voice cracked on the second syllable. Margot stood up from her chair like a guard dog ready to lunge. "You have exactly 1 minute," she said. Konstantin nodded. He didn't argue, he didn't posture. He walked to the side of the bed and looked at the baby in Seraphine's arms, his daughter, and something in his face broke open. "I'm sorry," he said, and the words were barely audible. "I'm sorry for everything." Serafina looked at him. She looked at this man she had loved, this man she had sacrificed for, this man who had watched his mother slap her pregnant belly and done nothing. She looked at him and felt a complex symphony of emotions that she knew she would spend years untangling. "Sorry isn't enough, Konstantin," she said quietly. The words came out without anger, without venom. They came out with the quiet finality of a door being closed. "I know. You watched her hit me. You watched her degrade me for months. You had an affair. You told your mistress I was nothing." Each word landed on him like a stone. He flinched. He didn't defend himself. He didn't make excuses. He just stood there and received it. "I know what my mother did," he said. The medication. The manipulation. I heard her on the phone at the hospital. I know about Natasha, how she arranged it. I know about all of it. And I know that none of that excuses what I did. I made choices. Even under her influence, I made choices. And they were wrong. Serafina was quiet for a long time. The baby made a soft sound. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the first light of dawn was creeping across the sky. "I don't want your apology," Serafina said finally. "I want a divorce." Konstantin closed his eyes. A tear slid down his cheek. He nodded. "You'll have it," he said. "On whatever terms you want. I'll sign anything. I just want you to know that the man you married, the man on the cliffs, the man at the gala who saw you looking at the ceiling, he was real. He got lost and buried under years of his mother's control, but he was real." Serafina looked at him one last time. "Then find him," she said. "Not for me, for yourself, and for her." She tilted her head toward Evangeline. Konstantin looked at his daughter. He reached out a hand, then stopped, as though asking permission. Serafina nodded, just slightly. He touched the baby's hand with one finger. Evangeline wrapped her tiny fingers around it and held on. For 3 seconds, the room was perfectly still. And in that stillness, something shifted, and not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but the faintest, thinnest thread of something that might, one day, become understanding. Then Konstantin withdrew his hand, wiped his eyes, and left. The weeks that followed were a hurricane of legal proceedings, financial restructuring, and public reckoning. The news of the press conference spread like wildfire. Within hours, it was the most discussed story in the country. Social media exploded, hashtags trended, financial analysts scrambled to reassess the Volkov Group's viability, and in living rooms and offices and coffee shops across the nation, people who had never heard the name Serafina Moreau suddenly couldn't stop saying it. Vladislava was formally charged and denied bail after prosecutors argued she was a flight risk. Her lawyers, the best money could buy, scrambled to build a defense, but the evidence was overwhelming. The shell company records, the private investigators' findings, Konstantin's own medical records confirming the presence of the unprescribed stimulants, and Konstantin himself, who, in a decision that stunned the legal world, agreed to testify against his own mother. The Volkov Group's board of directors, faced with the suspension of critical permits, a $62 million debt, and the catastrophic public relations disaster, voted unanimously to remove Vladislava from all positions and begin restructuring. Shares plummeted, investors fled, 3 major developments were halted, and then Serafina made a move that nobody expected through Theron Blackwell. She offered the Volkov Group a deal. She would reinstate the permits and restructure the licensing debt on 2 conditions. First, the company would undergo a complete financial audit by an independent firm. Second, a percentage of all future profits from the developments built on Moro-licensed technology would be directed to a charitable foundation for victims of domestic abuse and coercive control. The board accepted within 24 hours. Financial press ran the story for weeks. Every business channel, every economics podcast, every industry journal covered the unprecedented move. The media called it the Moreau maneuver. Analysts called it brilliant. But for Serafina, it was simpler than that. It was about building something. It was about taking the broken materials of her life and constructing something that could stand. Something that could shelter others the way she had never been sheltered, that her father would have understood. Natasha Serova disappeared from public life almost overnight. Once Vladislava's arrest became national news, Natasha realized that her comfortable position as the arranged mistress of a Volkov heir was not only over but toxic. She deleted her social media, broke her lease, and was last seen boarding a flight to an unknown destination. She sent Serafina a message before she vanished. It was 2 sentences long. "I knew what I was part of. I'm sorry I wasn't stronger." Serafina read it once, then deleted it. Forgiveness, she was learning, is not a single act but a process, and some processes take longer than others. The divorce was finalized for months after Evangeline's birth. True to his word, Constantine signed everything without contest. Serafina received full custody, a generous settlement that she donated entirely to her foundation, and something far more valuable than money, her freedom. She moved to a house by the sea. She found it on a rainy Tuesday, driving along the coast, rode with Evangeline sleeping in the back seat. It was modest by any standard, certainly by Volkov standards. White walls, a blue door, wide windows that looked out over the ocean, a garden with wildflowers that grew in unruly, beautiful tangles. The real estate agent apologized for the size. Serafina signed the papers that afternoon. It was nothing like the Volkov estate. There was no marble, no chandeliers, no 40-foot mahogany table. The kitchen was small. The floorboards creaked. The wind came through the window frames in winter dart. It was better, it was hers. Margot visited every weekend. Theron called every Tuesday. And slowly, carefully, like a woman how to walk after a long illness, Serafina rebuilt her life. She returned to architecture. Her first project was a community center in Beaumont, her hometown, designed for families in crisis. It featured open spaces, natural light, and structural walls that could withstand any storm. She named it the Raphael Moreau Center, and on the day it opened, she stood in the main hall with Evangeline on her hip and cried for the first time in over a year. They were good tears, the kind that wash clean. As for Constantine, his path was harder. Without his mother's control, without the stimulants, without the empire and the armor it provided, he was forced to confront who he actually was. It was not a pleasant process. He checked himself into a rehabilitation facility, not for drugs, but for what his therapist called identity reconstruction. He had to learn, at the age of 35, how to be a person rather than a product. The process was not linear. There were dark days, days when the trauma surfaced without warning, triggered by a stranger's sharp tone or the scent of a particular wine or the sound of heels on marble. There were nightmares, therapy sessions that left her hollowed out and raw. Moments when she held Evangeline and wept, not from sadness but from the sheer overwhelming relief of having escaped a life that would have destroyed them both. But she kept going. The way buildings keep standing. Not because they don't feel the wind, but because they were built to withstand it. Constantine sent Serafina a letter 6 months after the divorce. It was handwritten, 3 pages. It did not ask for reconciliation. It did not ask for anything. It simply told her about his progress, his therapy, his growing understanding of the damage he had caused. And at the end, he wrote a single line. About Evangeline, tell her when she's old enough that her father is trying to become someone she can be proud of. Serafina read the letter at her kitchen table while Evangeline slept in the next room. She folded it carefully, placed it in a drawer, and looked out the window at the sea. She did not write back, not yet, but she kept the letter up. And keeping, it was its own kind of answer. Vladislava's trial lasted 3 weeks. It was the most watched legal proceeding of the year. The prosecution presented a devastating case, financial records, medical evidence, testimony from household staff who had witnessed the abuse, and, most damningly, Constantine's own testimony about a lifetime of manipulation. When Vladislava took the stand in her own defense, she was defiant, imperious. She called Serafina a common opportunist. She called the charges a witch hunt orchestrated by a woman who married above her station. She stared down the prosecutor and said, "Everything I did for this family." The jury deliberated for 4 hours. They found her guilty on all counts. Vladislava Volkov, was sentenced to 7 years in a federal facility. As she was led from the courtroom, cameras captured a moment that became the defining image of the trial. Vladislava, in handcuffs, walking past the gallery, looked up and saw Serafina sitting in the third row. She was holding Evangeline. The baby was asleep, and Serafina was looking at Vladislava with an expression that carried no hatred, no triumph, no vindication, just peace. Vladislava opened her mouth to speak. No words came. She was led away. The gallery sat in stunned silence as Vladislava was led through the door at the back of the courtroom. Some of the journalists were crying. Even the judge paused for a moment, removed her glasses, and rubbed her eyes before dismissing the court. Outside the courthouse, journalists swarmed Serafina, microphones were thrust toward her. Questions flew from every direction. How do you feel? What's your message to other women in similar situations? Do you forgive the Volkov family? Serafina adjusted Evangeline on her hip, squinting against the flash of cameras, as said the only thing that mattered. My father taught me that the strongest buildings aren't the ones with the tallest towers or the thickest walls. They're the ones with the deepest foundations. I spent a year having my foundation tested, and it held. She paused. Evangeline stirred in her arms. The cameras clicked. To any woman listening who is being told she is nothing, who is being controlled, diminished, struck, silenced, I want you to know something. Your foundation is stronger than they think. Stronger than you think. And the day will come, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but it will come, when you will stand in your truth and the people who tried to break you will be the ones who fall. The clip went viral within the hour. It was viewed over 40 million times. It was translated into 23 languages. It was printed on posters and shared in support groups and quoted by politicians and therapists, and ordinary people around the world who recognized, in Serafina's words, their own unspoken truth. And Serafina, she walked through the crowd, past the cameras and the microphones and the shouting, got into a modest sedan, buckled Evangeline into her car seat, and drove to the coast. The house by the sea was waiting. The windows were open and the salt air carried the sound of waves. Serafina carried her daughter inside, laid her gently in her crib, and stood for a moment in the nursery she had designed herself. The walls were painted the color of sunrise. The mobile above the crib was shaped like little buildings, tiny towers and bridges and arches that spun slowly in the breeze from the open window. She placed her hand on the railing of the crib and looked down at her sleeping daughter. Your grandfather would have loved you, she whispered. He built things that lasted, and so will we. Outside, the sun was setting over the ocean. The sky was painted in shades of gold and rose. The waves broke and reformed, in the endless, patient rhythm of a world that destroys and creates, that tears down and builds up, that takes everything from you and then, if you are brave enough, if you are patient enough, if you are strong enough, gives it all back. Serafina Moro stood in her own house, in her own life, with her own child, and breathed. She was free, and the foundation held. There is a postscript to this story, because the best stories don't end when the credits roll. They continue in the quiet moments after. 2 years later, the Rafael Moreau Foundation had grown into one of the most respected domestic abuse charities in the country. Serafina served as its chair while running her own architecture firm, which had won 3 national awards for its work designing safe houses and community shelters. Margot served as the foundation's chief financial officer, bringing the same forensic precision to charity work that she had brought to dismantling the Volkov Empire. Konstantin, true to the promise in his letter, had transformed himself. Not into the powerful heir his mother had tried to create, but into something quieter and more genuine. He worked as a project manager for a mid-sized construction company, earning a fraction of what he once had, and he volunteered on weekends at a youth mentorship program for boys growing up without positive male role models. He saw Evangeline every other weekend. He never missed a visit. He arrived precisely on time, with a small gift, usually a children's book about buildings, because even in his fumbling attempts at fatherhood, he was trying to honor who Serafina was. He never raised his voice, he never made demands, and he never, not once, tried to control the narrative. It was not a fairy tale reconciliation. Serafina and Konstantin did not fall back in love. They did not remarry. But they learned, slowly and imperfectly, to co-parent with respect. They learned to put Evangeline first. And on the weekends when Konstantin brought her back, when he stood at the door of the house by the sea and handed their daughter over with careful, gentle hands, There was a moment, just a moment, when their eyes would meet and something unspoken would pass between them. Not love, not forgiveness, not yet, but the acknowledgement that they had both survived something terrible, and that the small person they had created together was the proof that even from the darkest soil, life finds a way to grow. As for Vladislava, prison was its own kind of justice, not the concrete walls or the institutional food or the scratchy uniforms. Though those were a particular torture for a woman who had spent her life wrapped in cashmere and silk, the real punishment was the silence. No one to command, no one to control, no audience for her performances. Just the echo of her own thoughts in a cell that was smaller than her former closet. She served 5 years of her 7-year sentence before being released on good behavior. She emerged from prison, diminished. The empire was gone. The mansion had been sold to cover debts. The name Volkov, once synonymous with power and prestige, was now a cautionary tale studied in business, ethics courses, and psychology textbooks. Vladislava moved to a small apartment in a city where nobody knew her name. She lived quietly. She did not contact Constantine. She did not contact Serafina, and she never met Evangeline. Some stories end with a villain's redemption. Some end with a dramatic confrontation or a tearful apology on bended knee. This one ends with a villain's irrelevance. Because the cruelest punishment for a woman who lived for power is not prison, it is insignificance. It is the world continuing. To turn without her, it is her name becoming a footnote in someone else's triumph. And Seraphine's triumph was not loud. It was not vengeful. It was the quiet, daily act of living a life on her own terms. It was the sound of Evangeline laughing in the garden. It was the weight of a pencil in her hand as she sketched a new building. It was the solitaire through the open window and the knowledge, bone deep and unshakable, that she had walked through the fire and come out the other side, not unscathed, never unscathed. The scars were there, they would always be there, but scars are not weakness. The scars are proof. Proof that the wound was real and that the healing was realer. On the mantel of the house by the sea, Serafina kept 2 photographs. One was of her father Raphael, standing on the cliffs of Beaumont with the ocean behind him and a blueprint in his hand. He was smiling, the kind of smile that comes from knowing exactly who you are and being at peace with it. The other photograph was of Serafina and Evangeline, taken on the day the Raphael Moreau Center opened. Serafina is holding her daughter, Evangeline is reaching toward the camera with one small hand, and behind them, through the glass doors of the center, you can see the main hall, flooded with light. The foundation held, it always does, when it's built on something real. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something, if it reminded you of your own strength or the strength of someone you know, then carry it with you. Share it, not because it's entertainment, but because somewhere, right now, there is a woman sitting alone in a house that doesn't feel like hers, being told she is nothing, and she needs to know that her story doesn't end there. It doesn't end there, it begins. And if you stayed through every twist and every tear and every moment of this story, then you already know something important about yourself. You know that you care about justice. You know that cruelty makes you angry and courage makes you hope. And you know, deep in your bones, that the strongest people in this world are not the ones with the loudest voices or the biggest houses or the most zeros in their bank accounts. They are the ones who endure. They are the ones who build. They are the ones whose foundations hold.